everyone, and welcome back. And today is December 23rd. Well, it's not really December 23rd when I'm filming this, but I know it's going to fall on December 23rd because this is our third video in our vintage series, which is the last running week of the 2023 Christmas series. Yeah, say that 10 times fast. Nope, I can't tell you how many times I've hit the record button for this. Just saying. Anyway. We're going to continue with our vintage. So the first one, very vintage, full-blown, my style, grunge, vintage photo all over the place. I'm surprised I just can't pour it over my card. The next one, we just focused on die cuts. And again, they could be die shapes. Add a little bit of greenery or foliage, and you can make it look or have the feel of something vintage. Add a Christmas sentiment or a holiday sentiment, and you are there. For this one, we're going to focus on an object. So for this one, I'm going to be using bells. And we're going to go straight to the card base. So no fancy papers, no fancy backgrounds, just the bells sitting in the front. And to show you the look that just even a sentiment, a vintage style sentiment, can change the way something looks. Now, with all of my vintage cards, there is vintage photo, so we are going to pull that in just a little bit. But you'll see that we can just add a little bit of texture to that background and just have a little bit of that element sitting right onto our card base. Okay? I am going to switch over to voiceover again, so we've got some gabbiness like it is in the beginning and the end. And then, of course, at the end, we'll come back and we'll talk about the card. If there were any challenges, what I changed from what I just said now, because, you know, hey, that can happen. I may have an idea and then I'm going to change it in midstream. All right, so grab your supplies. If you have a bell, or maybe it's another image, maybe it's a big bow. Use that. Again, look at how the card's coming together and the technique being used, and let's have fun creating together. All right, so grab those supplies and let's go. Now we're even going to go lighter. We're going to take a holiday image, a Christmas image. So bells. Now this is a layering die, but using traditional colors, you know, greens, reds, golds, some ivory, and just keep this very, dare I say, clean and simple, but have a vintage touch to it. This can also be achieved just by your sentiment. So there are a lot of sentiments out there that have that vintage look, that vintage script. You can see the ones that I'm using are on red rubber. Tim Holtz had come out with about 3 or 4 sets of some beautiful old world Christmas vintage style sentiments. And those are always my go-to. Now, I know Simon Says has some, all of them do. But again, those are the ones that I gravitate to. And just by adding that type of a sentiment, it's going to give you a vintage feel, a vintage look. Now, of course, vintage photo does come into this, but very lightly, very lightly. And what I'm also going to do is go straight to the card base, which is very rare. I very rarely go straight to my card base and apply my images, my sentiments, or anything like that. I usually, 99.9% of the time, I'm using what I refer to as a design base. And I do all of my work on that panel, and then I take that panel to the card base or put it on a mat to the card base. This time I'm not. So we don't always have to have all of those different layers going on when it comes to our card. Even though vintage, and again, vintage does have that dirty. I'll call it dirty. It's a horrible term, but it does. It's aged. hence the term vintage. It doesn't have to be completely that. You could just by adding brown cardstock and a gold sentiment, that can give it its feel also. Okay, so again, things to think about. You may not like the vintage because, again, I take it to the next level. I go all out. Here's the vintage photo. You can see it's very little around the outside. That's it. Here's our card base. So playing with the placement of where things are going. That background is white, completely white, not touching it with the vintage photo. I know, shocking. I'm playing around with my sentiments. You saw those there. This is the one that I choose. Absolutely love it. It's nice, big, and bold. So's our focal point, those bells. They're big, they're bold. And that's what we're going to do. But notice I'm stamping it on a piece of craft cardstock. And I'm going to use my gold embossing powder. Just doing those two things right there, with the sentiment being the way that it looks, having that gold embossing powder, and using craft cardstock or Nina Desert Storm, whichever you prefer when it comes to your craft, that's going to provide that look. It's going to give that look. You don't always have to drench your objects with vintage photo. I just love to. I mean, there's times where not only the vintage photo comes in, but black soot comes in. You don't have to do that. Okay, so by looking at how some people do the vintage style has turned you off from it. This hopefully will make you go, now wait a minute, this isn't so bad. Now, just putting that sentiment across there, it's a little plain. The only thing that I'm going to do is add a deep red, that deep color to come through, and just have a little bit of a border that's going to be above and below the sentiment, because this is going to go from side to side, this big banner. So I'm just trimming down the cardstock to make sure that it's centered. The sentiment is centered. And what I like is we're going to have the bells cross over it and not floating. I always like to ground whatever it is I'm working with. That's the focal point. I always like to have it grounded, meaning on top of a sentiment, sitting on the sentiment, or adding some shadows underneath it so that the image doesn't look like it's floating, no matter what that image is. And just by crossing these two bells over that border that we have, that helps ground them and say, okay, this is where I'm supposed to be. Give them that spot that is theirs. Now, because I'm working with layered dies and having all of that, I'm going to double up on the double-sided foam squares and then just set the other bell in place. Now, the two tops are not matching, those two loops there, and that's okay because the bow is going to hide that. And we're just going to put that on top there. I'm going to add a little bit of stickles to the bottom of the bell. I have to unclog it. Can't remember the last time I opened that, so I love using my stickles again. And just adding a little bit, just for a little bit of sparkle. Okay, third video down. I'm getting so sad. Although I'm going to appreciate the breathing. So here is our third card, our third video in our vintage series. And again, just taking an object and just adding a little bit of the vintage photo. I left the sentiment alone, but again, it's a vintage sentiment. You know, the type of script that you would see back at that time. If you have, you know, a different font type of sentiment, it's going to change the card just a little bit. And maybe you don't add the vintage photo or add those details. But we went right on to the card base as well. I am one where I lean towards to have what I call a design base, where I'm taking my images and I'm creating them on another piece of cardstock, and then I take that to the card base. I very rarely go directly onto that card base. I don't know why. It's just something that I've always done for the most part. But just having that little tiny border ties in with the bow, having the image, the focal point, where in this case it's the bells, come down over that, kind of makes it all look like one piece. So again, it just ties in. So we have different degrees of vintage. Maybe you'll find that level that you like. Maybe you won't, and that'll be okay. If you have any questions, make sure you leave those down below. Make sure you subscribe, make sure you hit the thumbs up, and make sure you ring the bell so that you know when the next video is ready for you to watch. Enjoy the process. Have fun creating your art. Take what you're seeing in all of these videos, whether it's one thing or a lot of things, and make it your own and have fun with it. But most of all, remember, always be creative in everything that you do every day. And I will see you with video number 4.